Most Americans woke up on October 27, 1962, not knowing they were living through one of the most dangerous days in human history. An American spy plane was about to be shot down over Cuba. A Soviet submarine was trapped under the ocean. Another U.S. plane would accidentally enter Soviet airspace, and inside the White House, President John F. Kennedy was being pushed toward a decision that could change the world forever. One wrong move, one emotional reaction, one misunderstood signal, and World War III could have started. This day became known as Black Saturday, the most dangerous day of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and maybe the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. To understand how everything almost collapsed, you have to go back to the Cold War. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union became the two most powerful nations on Earth. Both had nuclear weapons, both feared each other, and both believed the other side was trying to control the future of the world. But this was not a normal war. There were no direct battles between American and Soviet armies. Instead, they fought through spies, secret missions, political pressure, military build-up, and fear. Every country became important. Every alliance mattered. Every missile changed the balance of power. And then, Cuba became the center of the crisis. Cuba was only about 90 miles away from Florida. For the United States, that was dangerously close. In 1959, Fidel Castro came to power in Cuba. Soon after, his government moved closer to the Soviet Union. To Washington, this was terrifying. A communist ally of America's biggest enemy was now sitting almost next door. But the situation became far more dangerous in October 1962. An American U-2 spy plane flew over Cuba and captured photographs that shocked the White House. The Soviet Union was secretly building nuclear missile sites on the island. This meant Soviet missiles could soon be launched from Cuba toward major American cities: Washington, D.C., New York, Miami, Atlanta, Chicago. All could be placed under a much more immediate threat. When President Kennedy saw the evidence, he knew this was not just another Cold War problem. This was a direct nuclear crisis. But he also knew something else. If America attacked Cuba too quickly, the Soviet Union might respond. And if the Soviet Union responded, the crisis could move beyond anyone's control. Inside the White House, Kennedy gathered his closest advisors. This group became known as ExComm. Some advisors wanted immediate airstrikes, some wanted a full invasion of Cuba. Others believed the missile sites had to be destroyed before they became fully operational. The pressure on Kennedy was intense. If he did nothing, America could look weak. If he attacked, the world could move toward nuclear conflict. So Kennedy chose a middle path. Instead of launching airstrikes immediately, he announced a naval quarantine around Cuba. In simple words, the US Navy would stop Soviet ships from bringing more military equipment to the island. Kennedy called it a quarantine instead of a blockade because a blockade could be seen as an act of war. Then he went on television and told the American people what had been found. Soviet missiles were in Cuba. America was now facing one of the most serious threats in its history. Across the country, families watched in fear. Schools prepared emergency drills. People listened to every update. Parents wondered if their children would live through the next week. For 13 days, the world waited. Every ship movement mattered. Every message from Moscow mattered. Every flight over Cuba carried risk. And then came October 27, 1962, Black Saturday, the day the crisis almost broke open. That morning, tension was already at its highest point. US forces were on alert. Soviet forces were on alert. Cuba expected an invasion. Kennedy was under pressure from military leaders, and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev was trying to avoid humiliation without looking weak. Both sides wanted to appear strong, but both sides were also afraid, and fear is dangerous when nuclear weapons are involved. Then the first major disaster happened. An American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba. The pilot was Major Rudolph Anderson, Jr. He became the only direct combat death of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Inside Washington, this changed everything. An American plane had been destroyed. An American pilot was dead. To many military leaders, this looked like an act of war. Some advisors believed Kennedy had to respond. They argued that America could not allow Cuba or the Soviet Union to shoot down a US aircraft without consequences. The pressure to strike back became stronger. But Kennedy paused. And that pause may have helped save the world, because Kennedy understood that one military response could trigger another. If America bombed Cuba, Soviet soldiers on the island could be killed. If Soviet soldiers were killed, Moscow could respond somewhere else. Maybe in Berlin, maybe in Turkey, maybe directly against American forces. And there was something Kennedy did not fully know at the time. The danger in Cuba was even greater than Washington realized. Soviet forces on the island had tactical nuclear weapons. If the United States invaded Cuba, those weapons could have been used against American troops. And once nuclear weapons were used once, nobody knew where escalation would stop. But the most dangerous moment of Black Saturday was not only happening in the sky, it was happening under the ocean. Near the US naval quarantine line, American ships were trying to force Soviet submarines to surface. One of those submarines was called B-59. The US Navy did not know that B-59 was carrying a nuclear torpedo. Inside the submarine, conditions were terrible. The crew had been underwater for too long. The heat was extreme. The air was running low. Communication with Moscow was weak. They did not know exactly what was happening above them. They did not know if war had already started. Then American forces dropped signaling depth charges near the submarine. These were not meant to destroy it. They were meant to tell the submarine to surface. But inside B-59, the crew did not understand that clearly. To them, it felt like they were under attack. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, believed that war may have already begun. He wanted to prepare the nuclear torpedo. If that torpedo had been fired at American ships, the United States would almost certainly have responded. And that response could have pushed the crisis into nuclear war. But one man stood in the way. His name was Vasily Arkhipov. He was a senior Soviet officer on board the submarine. The torpedo could not be used without agreement from key officers. Arkhipov refused. He argued against launching. He believed they should surface and wait for clearer orders. In that moment, deep under the ocean, one man's calm judgment may have prevented a global catastrophe. The submarine surfaced. The torpedo was not fired. And the world never knew how close it had come. But Black Saturday was still not over. While one crisis was happening over Cuba and another was happening under the ocean, a third danger appeared near the Soviet Union. Another American U-2 plane accidentally entered Soviet airspace near Siberia. The pilot had become disoriented during a mission. Soviet fighter jets were sent to intercept him. American fighter jets were also sent out, and some of those American jets were armed with nuclear air-to-air missiles. Think about how dangerous that situation was. A lost American plane, Soviet fighters in the air, American fighters responding, nuclear weapons involved, and both countries already expecting the worst. If one pilot fired, if one radar operator misunderstood, if one commander believed the war had started, the situation could have escalated within minutes. That is what made October 27 so terrifying. It was not one crisis, it was many crises happening at the same time. A U-2 was shot down over Cuba. A Soviet submarine almost used a nuclear torpedo. Another U-2 accidentally entered Soviet airspace. Cuba expected invasion. American military leaders wanted action. The Soviet Union feared humiliation. And Kennedy had to make decisions under pressure that most people could never imagine. Inside the White House, Kennedy knew the crisis had to end before it escaped everyone's control. But ending it was not simple. Khrushchev had sent messages to Kennedy. One message suggested that the Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba if the United States promised not to invade Cuba. That was difficult but possible. Then another message made the situation harder. The Soviets also wanted America to remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Those missiles were near the Soviet border. To Moscow, they felt like the same kind of threat that Soviet missiles in Cuba felt to Washington. Kennedy now had three choices: refuse the deal and risk the crisis continuing, accept the deal publicly and appear weak, or attack Cuba and risk nuclear escalation. So Kennedy chose a careful path. Publicly, the United States agreed not to invade Cuba if the Soviet Union removed its missiles. Privately, the Kennedy administration also agreed that American Jupiter missiles in Turkey would be removed later. This private part was kept quiet at the time. It allowed both sides to step back without appearing completely defeated. Khrushchev could say he protected Cuba from invasion. Kennedy could say he forced the Soviet missiles out of Cuba, and the world could move away from the edge. The next day, October 28, 1962, Khrushchev announced that Soviet missiles would be removed from Cuba. The immediate crisis began to end. People around the world breathed again. But the truth is much darker than the official ending made it seem. The crisis did not end because everything was under control. It ended because several people refused to make the most dangerous decision at the worst possible moment. Kennedy did not immediately strike back after the U-2 was shot down. Arkhipov did not allow the submarine's nuclear torpedo to be used. Khrushchev accepted a deal instead of escalating further. And both sides realized that pride was not worth the future of the world. The Cuban Missile Crisis changed history. After it ended, the United States and the Soviet Union created a direct communication line to reduce the risk of future misunderstandings. Many people call it the hotline. It existed because both sides finally understood something terrifying. The world had almost reached nuclear war, not only because of planned decisions, but because of confusion, accidents, pressure, bad communication, and fear. That is the real lesson of Black Saturday. World War III did not almost start because one leader simply decided to destroy the world. It almost started because too many dangerous events happened at the same time. A plane was shot down, a submarine was trapped, a pilot got lost, military leaders demanded action, nuclear weapons were ready, and no one had complete control. Most Americans went to sleep that night without knowing how close the world had come to disaster. They did not know a Soviet submarine had been carrying a nuclear torpedo. They did not know one officer had helped stop its use. They did not know another American plane had accidentally entered Soviet airspace. They did not know the future of the world was being decided through secret messages and tense meetings. But today we know. October 27, 1962, was the day America and the Soviet Union came dangerously close to World War III. It was the day fear almost defeated judgment. It was the day a local crisis almost became a global catastrophe. And it was the day the world survived by a margin so small that it still feels unreal. So the next time someone says history is boring, remember Black Saturday. An American spy plane was shot down. A Soviet submarine almost used a nuclear torpedo. Another US plane accidentally entered Soviet airspace. Washington and Moscow were preparing for the worst, and the world came closer to nuclear war than most people will ever understand. World War III did not happen that day, but it came close enough to leave a warning for every generation after it. Sometimes the most dangerous moment in history is not when leaders decide to start a war. It is when fear, confusion, and weapons move faster than the people trying to control them. And on Black Saturday, the world almost ran out of time. If you want more hidden American history they never taught in school, subscribe for the next story.